Welcome to Agile Tour. My name is Vikas. I'm founder of Key Hubs. I live in Minneapolis, and I am super excited about being back here in Montreal. I've been here a few times, and I love this city. I love the people of this city. I am going to be talking today about the power of connection. The power of connection. Connection to self, connection to others. Now, why is this important in the Agile world? Well, we know that one of the core values of Agile is about people and interactions between people over process and tools. And the talk today is all about that. So as we jump into the power of connection, I want to share with you a little bit about my own story, my own personal journey, and how this concept of connection has become a central organizing principle for my career and life, and how it might be the same for you. I hope when you walk out of this room today, you will think about connection in a new and deeper light. That is my hope for today. So, my journey starts here in a small town in southern Ontario, Chatham. Anyone here from Chatham by any chance? Oh, really? Amazing. So I was born in Chatham. My parents made the long journey from India to Canada in the 60s in search of a better life. And if there's one picture that could summarize my life growing up in Canada in the 70s and 80s, it would be this. I wanted to be the next Wayne Gretzky. So my parents, despite having no familiarity with ice hockey whatsoever, were very open to my brother and I embracing the Canadian culture as much as possible. We embraced Canada, and Canada embraced us. But shortly after this picture was taken, I was about 11 years old when this picture was taken, my hockey dreams were crushed. Because as much as my parents were open to us embracing the Canadian culture, they did feel at times that we were losing touch with our cultural heritage, our roots. And even though they left India in search of a better life and having attained all of the trappings of material success, a house, a car, a nice yard, they were still longing for something more. They weren't fully satisfied. And so after this picture was taken, in an effort to get us closer to our roots, my parents decided to pick up and move us to Iowa. Has anyone heard of Iowa? Is anyone here from Iowa by any chance? Okay, Iowa's in the middle of nowhere, America. Why? Pigs and cornfields. Why would my parents, who want to get my brother and I closer to our Indian roots, pick up and move to Iowa? Any ideas? Yes, it's ridiculous. Well, little do people know that Iowa is home to Maharishi School and University, founded by the Maharishi himself, who graced the cover of Time some time ago and became famous for influencing the Beatles and bringing transcendental meditation to the West. So my parents, ironically, being from India, came to Canada to discover an Indian guru. Okay, now most of my family in India thought my parents were nuts. So you leave India to come to Canada, only to move to the cornfields of Iowa to follow an Indian guru. And now, some of my family was obviously concerned that maybe we had joined some sort of cult, right? I mean, it certainly had some of those qualities. But overall, it was a very positive, unusual experience, very eclectic community that I grew up in. I went on to study computer science at Maharishi University, and I joined a software startup that was founded by a professor there. And in a few short years, I realized that maybe I had left one cult only to join another. And that is what I would call the cult of Dilbert. How many people here feel like maybe at times you're also working or living in this cult? Anyone? No? A little bit? Has anyone heard of this? Do they have a French version of Dilbert? That's what I want to know. Well, I took solace in Dilbert. I worked for 2 startup companies for the first 15 years of my career, and these companies were wildly successful. They were founded by passionate entrepreneurs. They grew, they went public. At their peaks, they were worth $500 million. So they're very successful, and despite all that outer material success, there were times where it felt like I was living in a cartoon. And I would read Dilbert and find some comfort knowing that I wasn't the only one suffering, that this Dilbert, hallelujah. No, I'm sorry. I took comfort in Dilbert because I realized I wasn't alone in this suffering, and that the experience I was having in this Dilbert world must be pervasive, otherwise how could Dilbert exist? Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but a lot of this Dilbert-like dysfunction that I was experiencing had to do with the fact that I was working in a hierarchical structure. And hierarchies do strange things to people and organizations, especially when you throw in monetary incentives. Because everyone, essentially, is incentivized to manage up. Your ability to move up, your annual pay raise, hinges on your ability to manage up. So the higher up you go, the more difficult it can become as you look down on that organization, that hierarchical structure, to differentiate talent and performance. There's this funny joke that hierarchies are like trees full of monkeys. And the monkeys at the top looking down, all they see are smiling faces. But the monkeys at the bottom looking up, they see something else. And so a point came in my career where it was time to move up, and I was terrified. I didn't want to be a typical Dilbert-like manager, and so I thought I should go back and get some formal training. So about 10, 12 years ago, I decided to go back to business school. And in one of my first management classes, they introduced us to this concept of informal networks. That yes, we work in hierarchies, but that's not actually how work gets done. It gets done through connection, through relationship, people over process, relationship over hierarchy. And if managers, leaders took the time to map this dynamic, they could make better decisions about their people and teams because they would understand how work is actually getting done through social channels. Who trusts who? Who's friends with who? That's the underpinnings how work actually gets done. Now, how many of you are familiar with this concept or have leveraged this in your own work? Raise a hand. Okay, so there's some. All right, so you're familiar with this concept. Yeah, so I fell in love with this. I thought, wow, this is the answer to the Dilbert problem, or at least an answer. And so being a software guy, I wanted to apply this where I was working at the time, did some research, talked to my professor, looked for some tools that would allow me to do this mapping. And at that time, a lot of the tools were catered towards rocket scientists and PhD people, not business people. And so I teamed up with a classmate of mine, and we started this company, Key Hubs, with really the hope and intention of putting a dent in Dilbert through the process of mapping these networks and helping leaders understand what's really going on in their organization. And so I quit my job a little over 8 years ago to pursue this work full-time. And we've worked with a variety of companies, big and small and everything in between, helping leaders see their organizations through the lens of connection, not just through the lens of hierarchy. And what we have found are some really interesting patterns. So just to drive home this idea a little bit more, the hierarchy, the org chart, which is pretty much the only visual that companies use to describe their organization, is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay? If we ask people in this organization things like, well, who inspires you to be a better person, to be a better coworker? Who do you like to hang out with in your free time? If you take those and map those relationships using software visualization tools, you end up with a very different chart that looks nothing like the hierarchy, but rather a dynamic web of interconnected relationships. And that web can tell you a ton about what's really going on in your organization underneath the surface, underneath the hood. And what we find is that many times the highly connected, highly influential people are not the ones at the top. It's the administrative assistant. It's the financial analyst. And so what I want to do is share with you a couple of examples, some reoccurring patterns that we see showing up in organizations wherever we go. And how those patterns are not just showing up in our hierarchical structures inside organizations, but they're showing up in our social networks and our communities as well, and what that means for us, and how we might be able to recognize this pattern in our own life, shift it to advance ourselves and the world. So what are some of these patterns? So here is an organization that we worked with. This is a division of about 70 people, division that was performing well at some point but had taken a dive. They brought in a new leader to turn things around, and the new leader sensed that something wasn't right, that the organization wasn't really customer focused, another key value of Agile. And so he heard about our work and he's like, I need to figure out who my key influencers are. More specifically, I need to understand who are the role models when it comes to delivering awesome service. So part of our work involves designing tailored surveys that are then taken by employees online, and the answers are put through a visualization engine that we've developed. And so this is the resulting map that came out of the question around who is a role model, who is a positive influence in our organization, who's a role model when it comes to delivering awesome service. So what do you see here? Well, this person, so each of these nodes represent employees, and the arrows represent responses to that question. And so you have some people on the periphery, like this person was picked once, this person was picked once, and this person picked this person. This person here is a moderate hub in the organization when it comes to awesome service. But this person, who is this? This is a key hub, a central role model in the organization. And we went into the boardroom and asked the leaders, who is this person? Who do you think this key blue hub is? And they're like, oh, it must be John, it must be Mary, it must be Francois. Okay? They rattled off all these names that were wrong, and they were surprised. How could we not know who this key hub is? But when we take this network and we overlay it on the actual formal hierarchical structure of the organization, this is what you get. This highly influential, highly connected person is buried in the organization 4 levels deep, out of sight, out of mind. So one of the patterns that we see happening is hierarchy creates separation. When you have these layers of hierarchy, it becomes very difficult to see what's happening at the lowest levels. So this is a pattern that we see pretty much everywhere we go. To some degree, influence is completely independent of hierarchy, and oftentimes the highly connected, collaborative, cultural pillars are not seen by leaders. So when you think about being agile or being influential or creating a culture of positive change, if you don't understand this dynamic, how effective are you going to be as a business or as a leader? And this is what I experienced over and over again in the 15 years of working in Dilbert, is that this person was out of sight. They didn't fight hard enough to keep this person when they felt underappreciated and overlooked and decided to leave the organization. Or when they decided to promote this person, right, instead of this person. And it was just Dilbert on top of Dilbert. So that's a pattern we see, and in our estimation, no business has any business of making important decisions without this kind of crowdsourced insight. Now, one of the questions that we get is, well, what made this person influential? Why are certain people popping in different parts of the hierarchy? Is there some common traits they embody that makes them influential? Because leaders are like, I want to be influential. I don't want to be this insignificant dot in this map of many dots. And what we found in our work over the last 8 years is there are 3 principles that tend to show up in these highly connected, collaborative, influential people. The first is they tend to cultivate a love for humanity, a genuine love. They love people, and it shows in their helpfulness. They serve. They like to help people. We've all worked in Dilbert world where you're supposed to go to this person to get assistance, and they're like, that's not my job. Stop bothering me. I'm busy. Or they never answer emails. Just goes into some cyber black hole. Right? You're not going to go to that person again because they weren't helpful. You find the person who helps you, especially the ones who do it with a smile, who are positive. So these are the qualities that we see showing up consistently in people that are highly influential, independent of their title or status. So bookmark that for a moment because we're going to come back to it in a little bit. The next thing I want to talk to you about is this other pattern that we see showing up everywhere we go. Here's another organization we mapped. This is a global organization spread across 6 countries. The leader was struggling. He's like, something's not working in my organization. Can't quite put my finger on it. Can you help? We mapped the networks. This is the knowledge network of who people go to get their work done. And you see some hubs. But the real insight comes when we overlay the departments by color onto this map. And you see there's some siloing. The green group isn't really connected to the tan group. Okay, that happens. But the real insight comes when we dive into the green team, and what we see is that there's a group of green folk, a little hard to see from the back, but this group of folks on the green team are disconnected to this group, who are disconnected from this group at the bottom. And the leader's like, this should not be happening. This is my largest team. They ought to be more integrated like this team. What is going on? And when we slice this data from a geographical perspective, we see, oh, this team is siloed along geographical and cultural lines. Japan is in red, off on their own. North America and UK are communicating because they speak the same language, and they're disconnected from the folks in Singapore and Japan, Singapore and Malaysia. And so this is a pattern that we see showing up everywhere we go, that proximity and culture creates silos. Birds of a feather flock together. It's sort of human nature. And if you look at the research on how networks tend to form, if you take a bunch of strangers, maybe like all of you, maybe you don't know each other very well, and if we just asked all of you to start mingling together, what would happen very naturally is you'd look around and you'd be like, who kind of looks like me? Who works maybe in the same industry? And you would connect with one another. And you would likely introduce each other to other folks who look and think like you, and you'd get these cliques, and these cliques turn into polarized cultures. This is social science research repeated over and over again. And so what's the big deal? We're sticking to our knitting. It's comfortable. Birds of a feather flock together. It's part of our nature. And we see that playing out in social science research, and we're seeing it play out in organizations that we map. Regardless of industry, size, we're seeing this phenomenon. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is there's also been some research that's come out in the last couple of years around the biggest predictors of career success. Now, when you think about career success, when I ask the question in various workshops and talk around what do you think is the biggest predictor of career success, what do people usually think about? What do you think are some of the biggest predictors of career success? Grit, persistence, yes. What else? Leadership, okay. Performance, what kind of performance? How good you kiss up to the boss. Yes, that kind of performance. What else? No, I'm just kidding, but not really kidding, but what else? Yes. Credibility? Yes. How many PhDs do you have? Happiness is a contributor, yes. Or maybe that's the destination, yes. Connection. Okay, yeah. Well, that's what I think all of the things you've mentioned certainly are contributing factors to success. But what's really interesting is that the biggest predictor of success, according to the latest social science research, has to do with connection, amazingly, and flies in the face of our natural human tendency to gravitate towards sameness. Okay? Now, when you think about connection and success, yeah, it's who you know. It's how many LinkedIn connections you have. How big is your network, right? There's that traditional idea that the bigger hub you are in a network, the more people you know, the more access you're going to have to opportunity. But that's really the old paradigm. The latest research will say, yes, the biggest predictor of career success has to do with connection, but it's not how many connections you have. It's how many different networks do you bridge. How diverse and open is your network. Isn't that amazing? It's not how many connections you have, but how many different networks, diverse networks, do you bridge. That is the biggest predictor of career success. Now, why would that be? Why? What's going on there? What the research discusses around why this might be the case, why having connections to diverse networks is the biggest predictor of career success, is you put yourself in the position of being a translator. Now, if anyone understands this more than others, it's the people of Montreal, being the largest bilingual population in all of North America. You're translating every day on a language level, which I imagine contributes to an enlarged perspective. But it's not just translation of language, it's the translation of ideas and points of view. When you put yourself in this bridge position and you serve as a translator of perspectives, that becomes the basis for the potential for the creative combination of new ideas, which is really the basis of innovation. This was the mascot at Maharishi University. No, I'm just kidding. I found it on the internet. It's the basis of innovation. It's how when you think about the great products that we love and enjoy, we love them because they are a creative combination of other products built in one in some sort of elegant fashion. A lot of the things that are new and innovative are just mashups of things that have existed before. And what's amazing when we think about bridging networks and having diverse networks, what's interesting is that how we interact out here not only impacts our ability to be creative and innovative and advance our career, but some of the most cutting edge neuroscience research suggests that how we connect out here impacts our connections up here. That having more diverse networks actually creates a more dynamic brain activity than having just friends that look like us. I mean, this is just the beginning of research, but the early evidence suggests that our outer networks impact our neural networks, and vice versa, that they actually work off each other, inform and influence each other. And so the way we position ourselves in the world may impact our own brain development, our own smarts, if you will. Now, so what does that mean when we look at this network that was spread across 6 different geographies? You have this person in North America who is a key hub, but his network consists mostly of people in North America, right? With the exception of one person in Europe. Versus this hub is a key bridge to every other country in this organization. They obviously have access to more diverse perspectives and information. They have put themselves in a unique position for growth, innovation, and understanding. But this research isn't just about diverse network. It's about whether or not you are operating in an open network versus a closed one. And I thought this was tremendously fascinating. What does that mean to operate in an open network versus a closed one? And the best way, or a way that has helped me think about this in my own networking and career, is imagine yourself as a sea creature for just a moment. Any sea creature, fish, turtle, shark horse. The difference between being in an open network versus a closed one is like the difference between swimming in the wide open ocean with no boundaries versus swimming in a fishbowl. And so when I saw this research come out around the biggest predictor of career success and being in an open network, I thought, well, is this true? Has my career been impacted by the networks I've been swimming in? Well, let's take a look. And so I went to LinkedIn and I mapped the evolution of my networks. And my networks began in this small town in Iowa, this unusual community. And these are my actual connections from that time. I was swimming in a very diverse and interesting fishbowl, but it was a fishbowl nonetheless, a very small community of people who looked at the world through the lens of yoga, meditation, and herbal tea. That was the extent of my world, and it so happens that there was a person in this network who started a company. And I joined that company, and over the next 11 years, I inherited another network of 150 or so people. It's what brought me to Minneapolis from Iowa. And for the next 11 years, I pretty much spent all my waking hours, other than weekends and evenings, with computer nerds and medical imaging people. And so my whole life, my whole worldview was shaped by my time in Iowa and my time working in this interesting aquarium. Now, after working there for 11 years, I'm like, I need a change. I need some change of scenery. And it so happens there was a customer in my network that had started a company, and I joined that company. And over the next 4.5 years, I inherited another network of 150 or so people. This is a company in the same industry, and there was some crossover, and I brought some people with me. And shortly after I joined this company, boom, I decided to go back to business school part-time, and I jumped into a completely different pond. And that change of scenery gave birth to the idea of Key Hubs. It's the reason I'm here standing in front of you. But if I looked honestly at all my networks up until this point, the truth was I was swimming in closed networks. They had defined boundaries, defined cultures. Few people, few fish were coming in, a few were leaving. In, for the most part, I was swimming with the same fish day in and day out. And so that was the extent of my life. And so what I want you to do is to think about the evolution of your own networks as it relates to your career. And you don't need fancy LinkedIn mapping to figure that out. If you simplify the evolution of my network, started in my undergrad network, which led to my first employer, my second employer, I jumped into grad school. This is 15 years summed up in 4 circles. Okay? And you have a unique journey yourself, and it's very important that you draw your own pictures. Draw them today when you're free and share it with someone here and say, hey, check out the evolution of my networks and look how it shaped who I am today and where I work and what I do. And think about where in your life and in your networks are you giving yourself opportunity to step into the open, wide ocean where there are all kinds of interesting sea creatures, where there are no boundaries, where no one is telling you where you can and cannot go, who you can and cannot swim with. I really didn't step into open networks until I stumbled into entrepreneurship and quit my job 8 years ago. I unknowingly changed the course of my career simply by changing the pools I was swimming in. When I quit my job, I knew I had to draw from my existing networks. I had a very limited runway. I needed to sell this service. I needed to find fish who would buy my product and service. And I identified 10 or 15 people in my network that I thought might be candidates, and I put big targets on their head. I called them up. I was desperate. I'd say, let's have coffee. You remember me from your past? I know I haven't contacted you for 5 years, but I'm really desperate now. I mean, I really want to have tea with you. Would you like to meet? And of course, they knew me, and they'd have tea with me, and sadly, they wouldn't, for whatever reason, wouldn't buy my product or service. Maybe they sensed the desperation. There must be something wrong with this guy, or faulty with his product or service. But what they would often do is pawn me off to someone else. You know, Vikas, I really like this Key Hubs thing. It's fascinating. We don't really have the budget or the interest, but there's this other person who might be interested. Now, that person was not a target customer at all. They had no budget. They had no reporting structure, but I had nothing better to do. I had no money to spend on grand ads, so I thought, well, I might as well go meet this person. We'd have tea. I'd desperately tell them about my product, and they'd be like, that's really interesting. You should talk to this person. And I'd meet that person, and they'd connect me to someone. And 5 or 6 links down the chain, and 6 or 7 months later, cha-ching, someone would be like, hey, this looks really interesting. I'd like to hire you for a project. And after about a year or two, I realized that there was no rhyme or reason to the sales process. It didn't matter who I connected to, because they were connected to someone who was connected to someone who was connected to someone who might be interested in my product. And so I started to just meet with anyone and everyone. I didn't care what their title was. I didn't care how much money they had to spend, because they might be the son or daughter of the CEO of Target Corporation or whatever. And so my network started to grow like a virus, a good virus. And what I discovered was that I was deriving more satisfaction and joy from just meeting other human beings than actually landing the deal. I was happier than I'd ever been. I was having conversations that I always wanted to have but never really had the time for when I was working in Dilbert world. My health was better, and I was felt like I was living a dream. And what I realized is that I had a duty to give back, because I was growing and my business was growing out of the goodness and generosity of other people's hearts. Their connection, their warm introductions were helping me, and so I decided to do the same for others. When I would go for a coffee meeting, I'd ask first, what are you looking for? How can I help you? And I would bridge an introduction for them. And what would magically happen all the time is within 24 to 48 hours, someone else in my network would make a connection for me. I always kind of believed in karma, but now I saw it playing out for real. And I invite you to do the same experiment. If you aren't in the habit of making connections for others, warm intros or email introductions, like I think you two should meet, try it. And what will happen is someone, independent connection, will make a connection for you. And so like this, my network grew. And this is my network after I quit my job. This messy hairball of hundreds, if not thousands of connections. But the beauty of this network is it had no boundaries. And it included people from all walks of life. Artists, musicians, entrepreneurs, corporate people. And my life was enriched in ways I couldn't have possibly imagined. My business grew and expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined. I'm here in front of you through this long and winding road of connection. Now, just as I was getting high and proud about my open, diverse networks, I realized that my networks weren't really open and diverse at all. A couple of years ago, I was invited to teach a full semester course in entrepreneurship at a inner city community college in Minneapolis. And when I stepped into that classroom, that's when I realized that I didn't know diversity at all. I thought I did. Child of immigrants, Maharishi, hockey, Minneapolis. But when I stepped into this classroom at this inner city college, I, I realized I didn't know diversity because in this small class of 30 or so people, I met individuals that represented diversity in every demographic dimension you can think of. Race, religion, gender, age, but perhaps most importantly, socioeconomic status. Some of my students had experienced homelessness or were homeless. Many of them had spent their youth in prison or their adult life in prison, former felons, gangsters, drug addicts, drug dealers, you name it. My students had experienced some kind of horror that I have never been exposed to. And I think I experienced neurons firing like never before. I had been swimming in the ocean for several years, but now I had stumbled on a coral reef teeming with unimaginable wonder and diversity. I couldn't get enough of it. I'm like, this is living. These students were teaching me the power and resilience of the human spirit. They were giving me insight into what it's like to live on this planet in a way I just did not understand. And I asked myself the question, how could I have lived so long and not met these phenomenal sea creatures? I live in a big urban center. And when we look at the city of Minneapolis-St. Paul through the lens of ethnicity, what we see playing out in our communities is the same pattern we see playing out in our social networks and organizations. Birds of a feather flock together. And it's not just the Twin Cities. If you look at New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, we are stuck in our comfort zones. We are sitting on the potential for unimaginable connection and innovation if we just take a little step outside our bubble. Now, I looked for a similar map for Montreal, and there wasn't quite one that I could find. And so what I ask of all of you is think about your own networks, your 10 closest friends. Do they look like you? Do they think like you? Or are they of the same religious background? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. When I come to Montreal, I experience something very different than any other city I've been to. I experience creativity. I experience artistic innovation. I experience this multilingual wonderfulness. I encourage all of you to continue on that path, to think about how can you make your network just a little more different. So I want you to think about your own networks. I want you to map them out, and I want you to think about, are they open? Are they diverse? How could I make them a little more open, a little more diverse? How can we continue to build on the culture that you have here in Montreal? That is this wonderful mix of language, culture, and possibility. It's unlike any city I've been to, and it's wonderful. So here's my question. My last question. This is my philosophical question for today. Why do we see this pattern playing out in our social networks, our organizations, in our communities, if the science is pointing us in a different direction? If we know that when we step into our discomfort zone and connect with difference, that magical things can happen. Why? Why are we stuck in our comfort zone? It's easy. What else? Fear. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Yes. So I've thought a lot about this when I saw this pattern playing out everywhere in my own life. When I was 14 or 15 years old, I stumbled on this book written by a man from my hometown of Fairfield, Iowa, called Oneness. Great principle shared by all religions. And what this guy did is he spent years, if not decades, combing through every major world religion. And he found that there were 64 common threads running through all the religions. And I was fascinated by this because my parents were really intent on raising me as a Hindu, a very dedicated Hindu. But when I read this very short book, I came home and I said, Mom, looks like I'm a Muslim, Christian, and Jew because they're all saying the same thing. When you break it down, our ancients have been saying the same thing for thousands of years. The same thing, that we are much more than what meets the eye. I started this talk about discussing hierarchy, that at the top of the hierarchy is just the tip of the iceberg. There is a hidden current that we don't see. Well, we are an iceberg. I see your bodies, but I know you have thoughts which I cannot read. And the question becomes, are we more than that? Are we deeper than that? And are the patterns that we see in our organization simply a reflection of patterns that we embody? The great teachers of all time have been suggesting that we are more than body, mind, and that the opposite of fear is why we're here. That this is the greatest force in the universe, and that we shouldn't just love the people who love us, but love our enemies. I mean, talk about stepping out of your comfort zone. And that this is a force to be reckoned with that can be leveraged in a way that conquers all. And this is the glue of the universe, because what our religionists imply is that the creator, the scrum master, is all about this force which is the opposite of fear. And that it's not in some far distant part of the universe, but lives in our very own heart, and that's what binds us together as one potentially happy family. I find this fascinating because I'm pretty sure Jesus and Buddha were not Facebook friends and couldn't copy each other's news feeds. I mean, these are people living at different times in different places in different languages, and when you boil it all down, they're saying the same thing, which science is now pointing to, which is if you want to have a successful career, step out of your comfort zone. Connect with someone you consider your enemy and get to know them. Now, some of you may not be very religiously inclined. Let's look at the most comprehensive research ever conducted by Harvard University. 75 years, the most comprehensive scientific study ever conducted in hopes of figuring out what are the secrets to a fulfilling life. They tracked 100-some Harvard graduates from 1910 to the present day, and what they found is that the secret to a fulfilling life all boils down to love and connection. Love is all that really matters. Can you believe that came out of a 75-year Harvard study? And that it essentially is pointing to the truths that our great religious teachers have been pointing us to for millennia. You know, in some ways people think religion is backwards and behind. I would argue that it's far ahead because science hasn't quite figured out the spirit part. And so with that, I want to reinforce these threads that we see showing up, whether it be in our religious texts, our scientific research, the research around networks and career success, what we're seeing, what contributes to influence in organizations, it's all pointing to the same fundamental principles, which is also a fundamental principle of Agile. And so what I hope you will take away from this talk, I hope you walk out of this room feeling more inspired to connect with different kinds of sea creatures in the wide open ocean. I hope that you use the power of love to go into this ocean. So you might be thinking, well, how do I connect with diverse networks? Where is your heart calling you to? Where are you a little bit scared but curious? Go there and follow the connection trail and see where it leads you. And know that there's a relationship between how you show up in this world, how you interact with humans, and how that affects not just your brain, but your heart. And that the deeper you go here, the likely it is that the deeper you go out here. There's a big, beautiful world out there, not far away, right here in your own city. I encourage you and invite you to connect more deeply with yourself and others. It will not only transform your life and your career, I believe it's the basis for changing the world. Thank you.